Good morning, everyone. I'm going to get us started because I know we only have an hour together. And I'm going to start with my regular spiel that most of you have heard now. This will be the fourth time. But we just really hello and welcome to everyone. I'm Nora Dunlap. I'm the program officer for the MAT Access Point Project and the Center. And we're just very excited that you're able to join us today. The MAT Access Point Project, for those who are not familiar, aims to create a network of organizations throughout California to address the opioid crisis, specifically by supporting prevention, education, stigma reduction, treatment, and recovery services for people with opioid use disorder and substance use disorder, and by increasing access to medication-assisted treatment. And you are all a part of that incredible project. Throughout the project period, we are offering several technical assistance webinars for partners to access as resources. This is the fourth of a 5-part webinar series focused specifically on communications and practical skills to implement a communication strategy. The next topic for these webinars is today's storytelling for social change, and then earned media basics on August 13th. And more information will come about that webinar as well. Additionally, Change Consulting is providing open office hours or drop-in sessions where you and partners can get one-on-one or small group support for implementing the learnings and tools shared in the webinars. The next one is scheduled for next Thursday, July 16th from 11 a.m. till 12 p.m. And an email will go out to everyone registered for any of these communications webinars, letting you know the link to join that if you are interested. Just a reminder again that this entire webinar is being recorded, and along with the slides is going to be posted on the MAT Access Points website. Send your questions at any time via the chat box. Meredith and the Change Consulting team will help facilitate this conversation. And it's just truly a privilege for the Center and the MAT Access Point Project to sponsor this webinar, providing an overview of how stories are uniquely powerful tools in making social change. The webinar is going to share some of the science and strategy of storytelling and explore some storytelling approaches which can help you move your mission and work forward. With that, I'm going to again introduce and welcome Meredith Fenton with Change Consulting. Meredith has been working in and with nonprofit organizations her entire career. As a strategist with Change Consulting team and an independent consultant based in Oakland, she provides coaching, training, and partnership to progressive organizations and leaders so movements can better leverage tools of communication for social change. And with that, I'm going to mute myself and welcome you, Meredith. Turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nora. And thank you to everyone for joining us. It's great to welcome back some familiar names and faces and also welcome other folks from the MAT Access Points family into our session. And I'm really excited about today's session because I am truly dorky about storytelling and how important story and narrative and telling stories is to create the world that we want. And so just, by way of figuring out who's with us today, I'd love to invite folks to do some introductions. So if you'd love to either in the chat, share your name, your pronouns, your organization, would love to see where folks are joining us from today. And then I'd love to invite folks, if one comes to mind, to share a story from your childhood. Just any one that comes to mind. It could be a book, it could be a story that was told to you before bedtime, it might be a movie, it might be a story that you heard in your faith community, but just a story that has continued to stick with you and shaped your life in some way. I would love to invite some folks to do that. As we do our introductions. And like Nora said, I'm based in Oakland, and my work is really partnering with organizations to use communications, especially stories, as a tool for social change. And one of the stories that I think comes to mind from my childhood is I was obsessed with stories about like plucky girls who beat the odds. And so I think about the Ramona Quimby books, or the All in Her Family books. But that those were really, I think when I was younger, I was really hungry to see models of girlhood that were above and beyond sort of what I felt like was acceptable or normal. And so I like gravitated to all those stories that reminded me that there were like lots of different ways of being a girl in the world. And I'd love to invite my colleagues Anna and Dina just to say hi real quick and share maybe a story that's coming up for them. And Anna will again be today's chat monitor, so keep asking questions or sharing along the way. And if I'm not seeing it on the chat, Anna's going to help me sort of moderate and facilitate there. So Anna, do you want to just say hi and maybe share a story that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I shared this in the chat, but my story is The Wizard of Oz. When I was a child, there were no VCRs or DVDs or anything like that. And so once a year, it was probably the same day every year, the network would play The Wizard of Oz. And that was like an annual holiday for me. And I think I really love that story because it helped me understand that I already had my ruby slippers. So I already had everything I needed all along. And I will pass it to my colleague Dina to introduce herself and share a story that resonated with her. You might be muted, Dina.
Sorry, I didn't realize I had to unmute on my computer and my phone. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. This is Dina. My story, I don't think is necessarily like any sort of fairy tale, but I grew up in Russia, and my family always did a really great job sharing stories about our elders, so grandparents and great-grandparents, and I think those are the stories of their lives that I carry with me. So glad you're all here, and I'll pass it back to Meredith.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you to everyone who's sharing their intros and some of the stories on the line. I love hearing, Brea, about the story that your grandma told you, that she had it actually turned into a book. And some of these stories I haven't heard of. I've never heard of Love, Miss Rumphius, so I'm gonna have to check that one out. So we'll make sure to download these and share some of these story ideas back out. And you know, one of the reasons that we wanted to sort of invite that is that storytelling is something that's really inherent in us, that like lives within us, but often we sort of take it for granted. And so along the way today, please, we want you to continue to share either ideas of stories, including your questions, your reflections, and we want to make this sort of engaging as possible. So please keep that chat window blowing up. And just to give you a sense of how we're going to spend the next about 45 minutes, we want to start talking a little bit about why stories matter so much in the work when we're trying to make change in our communities. We'll talk a little bit about, well, what makes it a story? How is a story different than other kinds of messaging or talking points that we also need in our work and that we've talked to about on some of our earlier sessions? And then we'll spend some time thinking about how do you put stories to work and what are some of the kinds of stories that you might be needing depending on what your goals are and what your larger strategy is. We'll have some time at the end for folks to connect in smaller groups to sort of digest and play around with some of the things we're talking about today. And then we'll do some Q&A, and we'll end again reminding you just on some of the upcoming trainings and office hours that we have. Thank you. And I just saw somebody shout out Bridge to Terabithia. That was one of my favorite childhood books. Oh, I still can't read it without bursting into tears halfway through. Love it. So as everyone probably could think of a story or a book or something that came to mind. And part of that is because stories is part of what makes us as humans different than other animals. As long as there has been recorded history of humans, there is also recorded history of those humans telling each other stories. About a year ago, I actually had the wonderful opportunity to go and spend a week rafting in the Grand Canyon. And every day we'd get to stop and take these side hikes. And one of those side hikes was to see these pictographs that were over like tens of thousands of years old, and that ancient prehistoric people actually created these little pictures in the rock by taking a bigger rock and just sort of tattooing it into the rock. And as I was standing there, and it was very faded, right, over tens of years of erosion, but you could see that it was a hunter and a deer. And it was somebody recording the story of whether it was their hunt or a family ritual or maybe a feast. We will never know, but it really reminded me that there's just something innately human in how we relate to each other that we can't help but telling and passing down stories. And in many of our cultures, although we come from many different cultures, there is a really rich storytelling culture. I grew up in Jewish community, and it's a very oral tradition of handing stories down over time and over time. But it's not unique to Jewish culture. Many cultures have stories that are gifts that we hand down through generations. And so because of that, stories surround us all day long, every day, even when we don't necessarily realize it. Whether it's in the culture that we consume, in the conversations we have with each other, the books we read, the music we hear, we're surrounded by stories. And we even at night, our brain actually takes care of our body by dreaming and having stories that allow the rest of your brain to relax and lay back so that you can recover and be ready for the next day. So I'm going to show you a really quick video. And this is from the 1940s, so the only sound you'll hear is sort of a buzzing noise. You don't need to hear the sound at all. But I want you to watch this video. It's just over a minute long. And I want you to tell me, what do you see happening? Okay. And so, yeah, we're just going to watch the video. If you can have yourself on mute so that the little buzzing doesn't sort of echo through the whole webinar, that would be great. And then I'll just invite folks to share, what is it that you saw? So what did you just see? I feel free to unmute yourself and share verbally or chat your answer. But what do you think you just watched happen? Bullies. So I'm seeing Jean say that she saw bullies. What else?
Working together.
People working together. Say a little bit more. What was this? What did you see in terms of people working
The
together?
circle, saw the triangle being bullied, and so he was also very afraid at first, but then somehow the circle got a little brave and went and said, "Let's work together and let's try to beat this bully up," or something like that.
Right. So there was an intervention into bullying. I saw someone say they saw a story about unity, so similar. What else did folks think they saw? Did anybody have a different take?
At the end, the triangle had a temper tantrum and just had a destructive behavior.
So destructive behavior from the biggest triangle.
Mm-hmm.
What else did people see? So take a circular object taking advantage of a situation. Any other ideas or guesses? Oh, so a mama and baby. So a family, a story about a family. I also saw a story about out of the box thinking. I see Deborah saw that. Okay. So the actual answer is that you saw some shapes moving around a screen. And what this comes from is research that an Austrian sociologist did in the 1940s, Heider. And he was trying to figure out how our brains actually work when we see things that are in front of us. And what this research ended up showing is that we cannot help but mapping on a story to everything we see. Anything we see, we are going to put some sort of story on, right? So I've heard all sorts of things. I've heard that this is a story about intervention in bullying. I've heard that it's a story about an intervention in some sort of intimate partner violence or family violence situation. But I also had a group of folks tell me that this told the entire history of agrarian organizing in California. And I've heard other people, have all sorts of different ideas. And the point is that anyone that we're trying to engage in our work, if we are not strategic and thoughtful about shaping the story that they have about whether it's our work or our campaign or our organization, they're going to project one onto us. We can't help but do it. All day long, or when we used to leave our houses, you would see someone on the phone crying, and I would be making up a story about why I thought that person might be crying. We can't help but map a story onto it. And so the key piece to take away is that when we are intentional about shaping the story and filling in the blanks for people, they're going to make the meaning we need them to make in order to be engaged in our work, rather than letting folks sort of project whatever story they want onto our issue or our organization or our campaign. And so why is that important? So not only is it that we can't help but project stories onto everything we see, but also as a reminder, humans have a very short attention span. So we don't have a long time to get their attention before they start telling their own story or before they start paying attention to something else. And stories can hook people in a way that other kinds of information just can't. And part of that is about the science of what's happening in our brain. And so I won't do a deep dive into the science of storytelling today, but just a few things to know. One is that you've likely heard that your brain has the left brain and the right brain. And we all have both of those sides, although often one is more dominant. And the right side of the brain likes things like order and sequence and things that are, that are logical. Whereas the left side of our brain likes emotion and feelings and things that are more on that gut level. Stories actually engage both parts of your brain at the same time, because most stories have an order in a sequence that hooks your right side of the brain in, but they also evoke things like memory or sounds, or they paint a picture, so that other side of your brain is working. And just guess what? When both sides of your brain are working, it is more focused and more, you're able to keep people's attention longer. The second piece about storytelling that in our brains that I want to mention is that we all have built into the back of our brain a part called the amygdala. And you may have heard of it. Sometimes people call it the reptilian brain or the lizard brain or your downstairs brain. But it's the part of our brain that is wired into us to keep us safe. So back in the day when we were evolving, you're going down the path and you hear a rustle in the noise. And you're like, is it a rabbit? Could it be dinner? Or is it a mammoth? Could it be a foe? And you don't actually have time for a long, thoughtful process in your upstairs brain. So your amygdala just goes into what we call fight or flight mode so that you can make a really quick decision. It shuts down the rest of your brain to keep you safe. The thing is that when we are taking in information that is uncomfortable for us, or hearing something that is unfamiliar, our amygdala fires up in the same way as if we were staring down a mammoth. And as long as our amygdala is firing, it is very hard for us to be moved on an issue or to be able to tap into sort of higher order thinking. And one of the things that lots of research has shown is that stories calm the amygdala. And this goes back to the fact that many of us were actually told stories as a way to soothe us when we were little. or, to calm down the kindergarten classroom after recess, the teacher reads a story. It's actually calming our amygdala so that we can actually take in the information and get into the higher order brain to be receptive to something that maybe we weren't before. And that is the part of why storytelling is so effective. And at the end of the day, that is why stories help make social change. And just a real quick example here, if we think about the last about 10, 11 years when it comes to the story of who we now know are dreamers, there was a way that before folks like Jose Antonio Vargas and hundreds of thousands of other really courageous folks started coming out and telling stories about what their lives were like because of their undocumented status. Until we had done that, people didn't understand who this group of people were. There was no face to the ideas of some of the conversations we were having about immigration. And over the last decade, it is because folks have told their stories and a community has told their stories that we're actually able now to be in a place where we had a Supreme Court win not that long ago, right? Protecting these folks. But how can you create policy or get folks on board with standing with a community if they don't know who they are? And that really it's about stories that can make that happen. And that's because of everything I mentioned around the science of it and the other pieces about it, they have a unique power to get folks to empathize with people that maybe they have never met, or maybe they haven't understood it. And when they have empathy, it fosters people's ability to change their minds or evolve or to take a stand where before maybe they weren't able to. So before I move on for that, I'm just curious and would love to invite if folks have other reasons why they think stories are important. And I found this quote from Ursula Le Guin that I just thought was so, it goes back to what I started with, the idea that, we have had some societies that they had not invented the wheel, but every single society has told stories. So if you have other thoughts about why stories are so important in your work that you do, please chat them now. So what makes a story? So in order to be a story, it needs to have three simple things. One is it needs to be about someone. There needs to be a character. And that character might be a first person, it could be a second person, or it could be a third person. But there has to be someone who becomes sort of the guide that leads people through the story. Second, there needs to be some kind of challenge. Something needs to happen because Bob lived and died and nothing ever happened to him is not that interesting of a story, right? And so there needs to be sort of an arc where something is happening. And then the third element is change, is that at the end of the story, your main character, whether that character is, again, a person or a community, has gone through transformation, and so that we can make meaning. Secondly, a lot about story is about, are you showing people or are you telling people? When you're telling people, hey, here are some facts, and so you should support this program, you're telling them to do it. But when you tell them a story that shows or models the behavior that you want, or that sort of leads people in, and you're showing people what you're talking about, that's when you know that you're having a story. And so here's just an example from a campaign called Heal Safely, where they're really trying to get folks in the community to make plans so that they can avoid opioids in cases where they need painkillers. And they could just tell people, right, that sort of last sentence, avoid taking opioids, make a pain management plan. But in this way, they're sort of showing that that's the action they want folks to take through this story of a mother who was working with her son. So a lot of that showing instead of telling is about painting a picture. So things like little details, like naming that, on this day, Alvin was wearing a red shirt, right? Those kinds of details, though may seem unimportant, actually are what makes the story feel authentic. And those things start to increase what we call, which is narrative transport. That idea that you get lost in a story. Or it's the same thing that Netflix takes advantage of, is when you get to the end of an episode and they start the next one right away and you can lose a whole day that way. It's because of what we call narrative transport. And when we're transported into a story, we again get less out of our critical judgmental brain, and we're just experiencing it. So much so that we often, that our brain neurons mirror as if we've gone through what the person in the story has gone through themselves. And so all those things can really just help folks see it. You know, in the world that we're trying to create, a lot of times we're asking people to believe in something they've never seen, right? And so how do we do that? We need to paint a picture of it through telling them stories and having them able to see it so that they can get involved or take action. Also important in story is the idea of sequence, right? While there are exceptions to this rule, stories generally are much more accessible when they're told in chronological order, rather than going back and forth, right? Like not every story can be Pulp Fiction or Memento, right? Those are exceptions. And that, you know, there's been a lot of studying around things like jury cases, where when stories are told in order, you just can understand the story more. And so then it influences the outcome for juries if they're told sort of the sequence of events in order or not. So a note about data in storytelling. Data itself is usually not a story. And that's because facts, without sort of a story around it, don't evoke a lot of feelings. And so often facts should be the punctuation to your story, but not the headline. And so maybe what you might do is tell a story about an individual, but then say that, here's a story about Joe, and Joe is just one of 13,000 residents in our community who are impacted by this issue, right? So to show the scale of the story, or to show provide that validation. And also be thinking about, as you use data, can you storify it? Meaning, can it become a data that tells a story in and of itself, rather than the data that we often throw out at our audiences, which requires people to do math in their heads, or to be able to understand what these numbers mean. And so when you sort of wrap your data in a story, it's just much more understandable and much more impactful. So just a few notes on what we like to call ethical or decolonized storytelling, because we know that in many of our movements and in many of our communities, sometimes stories are taken from us or told in a way that causes harm. And so just a few things as you think about incorporating storytelling into your communications, it's really just about intentionality. And sort of, syncing it with the values that you already have and how you do the work and how you interact with patients and how you interact with funders. All of those values, right, can be mapped onto how you approach storytelling. And that consent is really important, that the person whose story it is should really be in the driver's seat in terms of how their story is told. And people's stories change with them. Right? So you may have someone who one day feels really comfortable telling their story, but then maybe a week later, something has happened in their world or their family where they're no longer comfortable doing it. And so that those things, that those boundaries and that the story itself will evolve with people, and really allowing for that. Some ways, particularly when you're working with folks who are struggling with substances or trying to overcome an addiction, we also really want to be careful, because there are risks sometimes in telling your story publicly. And so there can be sometimes creative ways to think about, how do you tell stories without having to lift up someone where having their story be told could be not safe, right? And so one idea is to think about second person stories, and that's where we talk to your audience in the you. So imagine if you were, or how would you feel if at the end of working every day, you still were wondering how to put food on your table, right? Those second person stories. You can also change people's names, or often we've heard the same version of a story 7 times. And so we can kind of put them together, and it can be a hybrid. I think also a way to do ethical storytelling is often bringing in culture and art and poetry and other things that can be very story rooted, but don't necessarily involve someone having to sort of say, hi, my name is this, and here is my story. I'd welcome other folks' thoughts about this, because I think it's really important, and we could spend a whole hour just on sort of ethical and decolonizing storytelling, but would welcome other ways that folks have thought about or been creative in terms of telling stories that really are impactful but intentional. So I'm going to transition now for the next about 10 or so minutes to talk about putting stories to work. So now that you know that they matter and you've thought a little bit about what is it that makes a story, how can you start to put them to use in service of your mission? So first, it's just a reminder that you are probably not going to tell everyone the whole entire 7-series novel or trilogy, right, of your work, because nobody probably really needs to know the whole story. So it's really about focusing in on the stories that are going to be most impactful, and telling the elements of your story that people need to hear in order for them to be able to take the actions you're inviting them to take. And so it always goes back to strategy. If you've been in our sessions before, we always remind folks that when you're not sure where to start, go back to that strategy, which is figure out, what is your goal? What is it I'm trying to achieve? Is it that I need to raise money by the end of the year? Am I trying to increase the number of folks accessing our services? Am I trying to hire a more diverse candidate pool for recruiting for jobs? But like, what are you trying to do? Then you ask yourself, who do I need in order to be successful at my goal? And those people are your audience. And then everything around the tactics and the stories is about targeting your audience so that they hear and feel the things they need in order for them to say yes to whatever action you need them to take, whether it's making an appointment, giving you money, volunteering their time, applying for a job, right? But whatever it is that they need to feel and hear, because it's not about what we want to say, it's about what our audience needs in order for us to achieve our goal. And then storytelling strategy is about all of that targeting. What are the stories that our audience needs in order for us to hook them in and be successful? And so would love to folks to start thinking about, what are some of the kinds of stories that you've told when you're trying to engage those target audiences? It might be stories to, someone earlier I saw said that stories are really important to demonstrate to funders your impact, right? And so those stories of, hey, you gave us this money and here's why it made a difference. That's a great idea. Would welcome other thoughts of how you use stories. And I'm going to talk about just some of the kinds of stories that, depending on your goal and depending on your audience, you may think about telling. So a lot of the stories that I recommend that folks tell are about showing your why. Because as we've talked about in, I think, almost every other session, until people understand your why, they can't care about the what's and the hows. But because you live and breathe the why every day when you show up to do the work, you can take it for granted. But we really need our audiences to understand the why. And so stories that sort of paint a picture of why you're promoting a particular solution. This is from Serum, and what they do is they take donations of medications to make them available for free to folks who would not otherwise be able to access their medicine. Another telling a why is like your origin story. Why did you get started? And this is from a friend and colleague of mine named Blythe Barno, and she created actually a service that churches can bring to their church to talk about naloxone and train people how to use it. And so this is her story of why she decided to sort of combine this strategy in this faith setting so that people understand why it matters and why she's up to what she's up to. Also about your why, like we said, it's about owning your impact. And while that might be sort of telling numbers, often it can come through like very short testimonies, right? Like these are not long paragraphs. They're 1 and 2 sentence testimonies from people saying why the Fair Food Program has been impactful in their lives. The why might also be about like who are you, right? Like folks need to know who we are to be able to stand with us. And so, this comes United We Dream, and they talk about that they are being led by and for immigrant youth. And they have stories of those young people on their website that you can engage with as you want to learn more about who they are. It's also important for folks to understand the problems that you exist to solve. And so here's an example from the Moms for Housing effort that happened here in Oakland, right? Where they're trying to tell a story about why had they taken this action of occupying a house that was empty to raise attention to the idea of all of these mothers with children who didn't have houses while a huge stock of housing was sitting empty. So stories that help people understand the problem, because again, people are often a step or two removed from the things that you see and know and work on every day. Another really important kind of stories are called journey stories. And that's basically if you're trying to get folks to believe something differently or to change their mind, rather than telling them, hey, you're wrong, change your mind, it's often really helpful to show them a story of someone who made the same journey that you're hoping they will. And so here's just an example in Pennsylvania where a legislator told his journey story about why he had gone from a no vote to a yes vote on making medical marijuana accessible in the state. We also often want to cue their identity. Like most people think of themselves as good people, but they also might think of themselves as parents or caregivers. And this is pulled from some work I've been doing with physicians who provide abortion care, where it's really important for physicians to talk about their motivations for providing care, and that it comes from this place of caregiving and that wanting to be a place that all patients could come to. And that hopefully by sort of talking about that in that way, we cue other people who think of themselves as caregivers to sort of stand with us or be able to relate in this way where maybe they wouldn't if we were just telling them what they should do. We often do that through the idea of mirroring. So if your audience, if you know who they are demographically or in any way, show them someone who looks like them. And so this is a story campaign that was related to fundraising at an organization called Dev Mission, and they were targeting tech workers in San Francisco to donate time or money to an organization that's nurturing tech talent in San Francisco's public housing communities. And so if they wanted more tech folks to get involved, we wanted to show them, hey, here's Brian, and he's a tech guy, just like you. And so here's a story that might cue them to do the same thing because they see themselves reflected. Again, I know I've said this before, but folks don't get to see what you see every day. They don't get to interact with the patients and the families and the communities that you do every day. So invite them in, let them see what you see. Whether that's on our digital session last month, we talked about like Instagram takeovers where you can actually hand over to some of your community so that they can be the guides. Or, this is an example from Digital Nest, and you can actually do a virtual tour where the young people who benefit from this tech center can tell you little stories along the way as you get to see the building and see all the spaces. And then lastly, tell stories about your vision. Where are you going? And so this is simple because No Kid Hungry, their name, is really also their vision of a world where no kid is going hungry. But particularly when we're trying to create a world that we have not yet lived in, we need to really help people imagine what is possible and where we could get to. I had one more, right? Which is the idea that sometimes there are elephants in the room, or we know there's things that are standing in people's way. And so similar to journey stories, we can tell people stories that help them remove those blocks. So that might be actually naming something that you know is a myth about medication access and medical treatment, right? So you might say, it is common for folks to assume that X, but actually the truth is Y, right? You use your story to actually name and remove any of the things that you know your audiences actually say, oh, but, right? Just remove those buts by telling them stories. So those are some kinds of stories. And so how to put this to use is just map it out. Look at everything you're doing and ask yourself, how can I add storytelling to this? That includes your materials, whether it's annual reports or brochures are a great place for stories. It's on your website, telling stories that are about your impact, stories about your origin, stories about your vision, any of the kinds of stories I just talked about. On social media, there's lots of ways to use stories with either testimonies or inviting folks in to read a story that one of your staff or members have written. Stories are also really good for your internal culture because they make people feel good and they make people feel connected. We used to, when I worked at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and I ran our communications department, we actually made it that at every single staff meeting, one of our standing agenda items was 10 minutes of story. We called it story hour, even though it was story 10 minutes. And when we first started it, people were nervous to tell stories, but it started to become one of the most popular parts of our staff meetings because it was just, tell us a story about how this organization has made a difference since we last met. And people loved it, right? And it just gets them growing those muscles of stories so that then they start doing it in the work as well. If you're doing media interviews or you're speaking or you're on a panel, there's lots and lots of stories that are great to bring in and tell actual stories. And when people ask you a question, you could say, oh, that reminds me of a story. Let me tell you a story. And then also for fundraising, whether you're trying to raise money or whether you're trying to thank donors, telling them stories of the people that you impact, but also stories of donors that again mirror the kinds of donors that you're trying to invite in to cue the kind of behavior that you want them to take, which is in this case, giving money. At the end of the day, there's just no such thing as too many stories. So if you remember nothing except for that, oh, I need to tell more stories, that is great, right? Short stories, long stories, testimonies, stories about your staff, stories about your community, stories everywhere is part of how we will start to create change. So I would love to now just give folks a little time to digest this, but in smaller groups. And so, Nora, if you can help me, I'd love to put folks in groups of about maybe 4 or 5, depending on how it works out. And we're just going to give you about 10 minutes to talk this out with folks. So, you know, how is this landing with you? What is it bringing up for you in terms of how you're currently using stories, how you could use stories, either you could expand or build on or strengthen your storytelling, as well as what questions are coming up for you. And so you'll have about 10 minutes to just chat with some peers, and then we'll bring us all together to close back out. So I'll pass it over to Nora now to break us out.
Perfect. I'm gonna create the rooms right now.
And if you haven't done this before, you're about to get a little invitation to say join breakout room, and you just click yes. Can we give folks like a 3-minute warning through one of those little signals then?
3-minute warning?
Yeah, 3-minute warning, just so they can know they start wrapping up before they get the 1 minute.
Done.
Well, that went fast. It's the 1 minute. You can do the 1 minute. Welcome back. We'll be giving folks will trickle in over the next few seconds.
Thank you both.
Yeah. So welcome back. And we just have a few more minutes before we wrap, but I'd love to hear if folks either had amazing ideas or burning questions that came up in their small groups. Feel free to either chat them or share them now. What came up for folks?
We talked about how in my culture music was a form of telling a story. So my mom never like read to us, but she always had like the big giant you know, I don't think albums you could say, and she put it on and she says, "Hear this story," and that's the way we heard stories. And so that's something that's more of the Latino culture. We wanted a comedy. A comedian was our way of hearing a story from our generation. So there you go.
I love that. Any other either reflections or questions that came up from your small groups?
We talked a little bit about, I think we're all in, or several of us are involved with social issues, and I work with an agency that reaches out to impoverished people in Vallejo, and I'm a videographer, and we were talking about how do you tell the story of some of these people's lives who may not want to be publicized, you know? And I had a thought as you were doing your presentation that maybe one way to do it, there's a central person who kind of runs the office, and she interfaces with everybody in the agency, and to kind of tell the story of the agency through her, and maybe protect the identity of other people, but because the story I'm trying to tell is really about the agency, and so I think exploring other ways to get to work around telling the stories about the people that we're reaching out to without highlighting them specifically or publicizing them is a great challenge.
Yeah. And, thinking about the stories on your team when you're telling the story of the organization, each member of your team has a slightly different answer to the question, why do you do this work? And that those stories can help you understand, like, what are the things that make your organization unique? Like, why are they doing it with you? And to sort of be able to then reflect out. But that often we think, oh, we have to only tell stories of the folks we serve. But often our own story can also be really demonstrative or really impactful in terms of what we've learned along the way. What have been our aha moments or changes we've made? Who have we met that has impacted us? And that there's a lot of power in those kinds of stories as well. Yeah, great. So I want to make sure we end on time, but I want to remind folks that if you had questions that came up, or I saw in some of the groups that folks were sharing some barriers around storytelling, we'd love to dig into them with you. And so a week from today at this time, we'll have our next office hours. And what that'll be is you'll just come for as much of it or as little of it as you want. You can drop in any time between 11 and noon. And Anna and Dina and myself and potentially a couple other colleagues, we're just here so that we can either have group conversations or we can also drop into breakout rooms if you and your team want to sort of dig deep into something you're thinking about. So that's a great way to sort of continue this conversation and continue thinking about creative solutions for some of the challenges or how to really take advantage of some of the storytelling opportunities you might have. And then in August, we'll be wrapping up this series with talking about media in particular, how to earn and work with media and journalists. And then we'll have one last office hours before we wrap all of this up. And just as one other reminder, just wanted to leave again our sort of a email where you could get to Anna and Dina and myself and our whole team at the same time. We'd love to hear from you, any feedback you have about these sessions, anything you want follow up on, or if you have questions, feel free to send them our way. And with that, I really just want to thank you for making the time to think about storytelling today. Like I shared at the beginning, it's something I could talk about all day long. And so I really love that you all joined me to talk about it today. And I wish you wonderful rest of your weeks. And hopefully you leave today with some new ideas and thoughts about how to infuse everything you do with storytelling.
We will be following up with some resources because storytelling is a lot to cover. And so I know in our group, we talked about some tips and tools, so we'll definitely be sharing those as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. And thank you all. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Meredith.